behalf of the program committee, I would like to welcome all of you to the third International Conference on Islam. This year's theme, as you know, is Islam and Democracy. My name is Mustafa Gökçek. I'm an alumni of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm proud to be so in the history department. Now I'm an assistant professor at Niagara University in history and Middle East and Russian history. We had the two previous conferences when I was here. It is great to see that these conferences are still continuing, and hope to see more of those in the future. We have a very exciting and high-quality program this year. Let me start by giving some statistics about the submissions. More than 135 abstracts from 31 countries are submitted for the conference. 35 of those abstracts were accepted, and there are 8 panels today and tomorrow containing 29 speakers in total. As of April 10, 2012, more than 100 online registrations were received. Selected papers from the conference will be published as a book. If you're interested in getting your paper included in the edited volume, please contact me primarily. But the editors will include Dr. Kuru and Dr. Voll. There were many people who worked during the organizing of this conference, and I would like to thank them all for their support. More specifically, I would like to thank Dialogue International, Global Studies, and Niagara Foundation for organizing this conference. I would also like to thank Kemal Karpat and Deniz Balgamış from Center for Turkish Studies and Yulay Şaminoğlu from Middle East Studies for their support. Finally, special thanks to Ahmet Kuru, Anna Gay, John Voll, Michael Thomas, Ramazan Kılıç, and Zeki Selitoprak for their efforts in organizing this conference. Now I would like to invite Gary Sandiford, Dean of the College of Letters and Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, to deliver the welcome speech. Please welcome Gary Sandiford.
Thank you, Mustafa. I'm not going to give a long welcome speech. I thought the last thing you want to hear is a long welcome speech from a dean when you have this fascinating speaker that's going to follow me. But I do want to say some words about the conference and about the participants. I'm delighted to be here this morning to welcome you to our campus and to this timely conference on Islam and democracy. I'm aware that many of you have traveled considerable distances to be here to present your work. And I thank you for making the journey to our campus. Individually and collectively, you represent a body of scholarship and analysis that builds understanding of the increasingly important changes that are underway at the sub-state, national, and international levels. It is particularly exciting to see the range of topics and perspectives represented in the program. The work that is being presented explores Islamic and democratic ideas and practice as they are lived in diverse parts of the world and in different historical periods. Similarly, the exploration of the role of everything from gender, religion, and secularism, law and society, identity, and even sports all contribute to a holistic perspective on Islam, political change, and social interaction. Your work helps other scholars and interested citizens alike understand the complexity and diversity of Islamic cultures, communities, beliefs, and practices, and their relationships to established and emerging democracies. I know that you will carry the discussion and ideas of this conference with you when you return home to your teaching and research programs, and that you will share them with your students and colleagues. In doing so, you will further expand the community of researchers and thinkers engaged in understanding Islam in all of its complexity. I also want to take a moment to congratulate the conference organizers for building such a robust program. It takes a lot of time, thought, and dedication to put together a conference that engages international scholars of the stature represented in the keynote addresses and the panels. To the organizers, I say, well done. And to the participants, I also say, well done. I hope that you enjoy your time together and your stay in Madison. And thank you for inviting me to be here with you this morning.
Before inviting Professor John Voll to give his keynote speech, let me briefly tell you about his background. John Voll is Professor of Islamic History and Associate Director of the Prince Alwaleed bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. He taught Middle Eastern, Islamic, and World History at the University of New Hampshire for 30 years before moving to Georgetown in 1995. He graduated from Dartmouth College and received his Ph.D. degree from Harvard University. He has lived in Cairo, Beirut, and Sudan, and has traveled widely in the Muslim world. The second edition of his book, Islam, Continuity and Change in the Modern World, appeared in 1994. He has co-authored with John Esposito of Islam and Democracy and Makers of Contemporary Islam, and is editor, author, or co-author of 6 additional books. He is a past president of Middle East Studies Association and also of the New England Historical Association. He has served on the boards of directors of the American Council of Learned Societies, the New Hampshire Humanities Council, and the New Hampshire Council on World Affairs, and the Sudan Studies Association. He has published numerous articles and book chapters on modern Islamic and Sudanese history. And this is definitely a shortened version of his bio. Please welcome Dr. Voll.
The most important thing is to make sure that I have my watch sitting here, because I don't see a clock back there. I must say I'm tempted to start with a reservation about the welcome that we just got from the dean. He listed all of the different kinds of subjects that are going to be covered in the next 2 days. And in that list at the end he said, and even sports. Now, I must confess that here in Madison, that probably is not the right tonality. And I should identify myself quite clearly. The first college football game that I ever saw, I saw in Camp Randall Stadium because my sister, who was then a piccolo player in the Wisconsin marching band, was there as my major star. I didn't really care that I was in elementary school at the time, and so I didn't know all of the particular football stars, but I did watch the piccolo play. At any rate, and I told a couple of people, the other experience, here I admit it, was my first sort of experience also involved spending the night in a girls' dormitory. But I guess I was so young that the house mothers determined that I was harmless. I want us to start with a couple of generalizations, and that's really what a keynote is to do. I mean, as the dean said, there are certain kinds of functions. The welcomer is supposed to welcome and get away. The keynoter is supposed to keynote and stop talking so that we can get at the substance. And that's what I want to do with a couple of particular reminders. We are really living in a time of significant transformation. Transformations of a whole wide range of fields of endeavor. And I want, because we're talking about Islam and democracy, to talk about then what kind of transformations are we looking at in terms of our current world for Islam and for democracy. I was pleased to look at the papers, and I see that somebody at least is going to make sure that you at least hear the name Jürgen Habermas. And I want us to be particularly reminded that one of those interesting things whose construction Habermas really developed is the public sphere. And when we talk about the politics of democracy and Islam, the public sphere is what I want us to look at. But basically, we've got a transformation in the public sphere of religion. We have a transformation of what we think of as democratic participation. And we have a transformation of the public sphere itself. Mustafa has already heard me read this particular quote, set of quotes, but as we talk about the transformation of religion in the public sphere, I like to start people by reminding them what people thought about religion in the public sphere 50 years ago. 50 years ago, or in 1968, the world historian Arnold Toynbee could assert without much fear of contradiction that, quote, all current religions, whether tribe-bound or missionary or lower or higher, have been losing their hold, just like we lost Cairo, have been losing their hold on the hearts and consciousnesses and minds of their former adherents. Religion was on its way out of the public sphere. Last year in the journal Foreign Affairs, Scott Taylor could begin an article with equal conviction that nobody was going to contradict him by saying, around the world, from the southern United States to the Middle East, religion is on the rise. The major world religions are all taking advantage of the opportunities provided by globalization to transform their messages and reach a new global audience. Basically, the role of religion in the public sphere, whether we're talking about Islam or Christianity, or even the Maoist resuscitation of Confucian traditions in China, or whatever, the role of what we used to call religion in the public sphere has expanded and become increasingly important rather than withering away and dying. And so that as we look at Islam and the politics of democracy, we need to keep in mind this first generalization then, that the role of religion in the current public sphere of modernized and postmodern society, the role of religion in general and the role of Islam in particular has been transformed and changed. When I was in graduate school taking comprehensive exams, in the time when Ramses II was pharaoh in Egypt and so on, everybody knew that religion was becoming increasingly narrowly an individual kind of focus. And now, of course, we can't talk about democracy or the public sphere in the Muslim world without concentrating on religion and without concentrating on Islam. So we've got that. But I think that secondly, and this is where, again, I want us to really have a little chance to be visual with this. I think, secondly, we have also got a transformation of what we mean by democracy. I think most people in the world will recognize and be willing to agree, okay, fine. You know, religion is now, secularization theory has now been disproved. Marx ended with the Soviet Union and so on. But the second generalization that I wanted to make for this morning was that the democratic, what we mean by democracy, has also been transformed as we get into the politics of democracy in the 21st century. And here we've got Armin and Cairo. And what I want us to think about for a moment is, in the public sphere, how do people participate in what get identified as democratic movements or anti-authoritarian movements? Now, we all are really quite used to this picture. And the advantage of walking around now, I promise I won't do my Methodist gospel thing and demand an altar call at the end. But I want to be able to see the picture too for a minute. But as we look at this, we're all used to this. I mean, this is a picture, or pictures like this are pictures that we have seen a lot. And this becomes a sort of normal thing. But it's not. It's a brand new thing. Okay? I have been blessed with the opportunities to be in demonstrations in Cairo for more than 50 years. Well, to be honest, I think the first demonstration I was a part of was in 1961, so it would be 50 years. They were simple things. People would sort of let the word go out, and how did you let the word go out? Well, you would send people around to the trick-track coffee houses, you know, where people were playing backgammon, and somebody would say, psst, you know, we'll be in Liberation Square tomorrow. It's a very slow-motion flash dance, you know, that, and people would sort of come, and then the party organizers would go over to the campus, and you would organize 5,000 or 10,000 students who would then come across this bridge here, and they would march into this big square kind of thing, and you would have lots of shouting and nice placards and so on, and then at the end of the day, people would go home. I never, in 1960, 1963, 1967, 1969, I never saw a tent with a library in it, or with a soup kitchen in it, or a medical clinic in it. I never saw that in Midan Tahrir as a part of the demonstration. This is the new format that now it has the handy label because of the American copycat movement of the Occupy space. That the new mode of political participation is this kind of occupation. And that tells us a lot of different kinds of things. It tells us, if we use the terminology of social movement theory, it tells us that the repertoire of modes of expression of opposition has changed or been expanded. That in the old days, when you had a revolution, the classic revolution, like the French revolutions of the late 18th and into the 19th century, were keyed around the idea that you would have then clusters of people that would be protected by barricades. And so in 1848, as this painting by Vernet gives us, the cry was to the barricades. You know, and you go to Les Miserables, and you can weep over all those nice young people who have been murdered or killed, or they get, I don't know how they all get tuberculosis from going to, but at least all of the ladies seem to get tuberculosis when they go to the barricades. But one of the core parts of the repertoire of contention in 19th century revolutions was the street barricade as a gathering symbol. And similarly then, as one gets into the 20th century, most people will recognize this picture. This is the 1963 March on Washington. And in the United States, the March on ... became added to the repertoire. And now no respectable cause, whether it's creationism or evolutionism or birth controlism or all of whatever, no respectable cause exists that hasn't at least at one point organized a march on Washington. Now you look at this. This is the most successful, I think, of that repertoire. It really set the standard. Hundreds of thousands of people, and as you look, there isn't a tent there. There isn't, except for a sort of word in the area. Most of you weren't born at this point, but if you had been born, it had been there. There might have been a few Red Cross ambulances off on the side or something like that. But this was the call, the announcement, the same as the Tahrir demonstrations in Cairo. Announce it. They had the advantage of long-distance telephone. Remember, no cell. Long-distance telephone, and then they could come, they could march around, and then they could crowd the subways and go home. But we have now then a new mode of participation, which is shaping the public sphere itself in terms of what it can do. in that you have then this third general, a transformation of religion in the public sphere, transformation of the mode of democratic participation, and the transformation of the public sphere itself. When Habermas was talking about the public sphere, there was an important part of that public sphere that was spatial. Some of you may subscribe to The Economist. And last summer, there was this marvelous picture, which doesn't come down as a JPEG, so that I can't, so that I didn't really put it into this. But it shows a cartoon 18th century coffee house, and one old geezer is looking to the other. Have you seen so-and-so's visage page? You know, visage page. Facebook. That Habermas's public sphere tended to have a very strong physical component to it. These demonstrations all have a strong physical component to it. But if you look at the Arab Spring, the starting public sphere was not physical. The starting public sphere tended to be in many ways Facebook and so on. I have this problem with vocabulary. It's fun being old. You know, I can say, because I was in demonstrations in Cairo before most of you were born, but it also then gives me vocabulary problems. You know, when I grew up, houses had windows. Moses had cabinets. And birds twittered. But those words give us a sense of a new virtual public sphere in which people like Ronan and so on could call people to come out to the whole new world of political participation. Now, in this, then there are certain characteristics in these transformations that are part of this. One of the early discussions, let's see how Kamal and Nasser fits into this for a minute. One of the early discussions in the New York Times of what was going on in Egypt, before the January 5th actual demonstrations in 2011. You have a very perceptive analytical reporter who is basically saying, you know, that in the old days, ideology was really important. When I was doing the Cairo demonstrations, this was the picture that you saw. And this was radical Arab socialism. It was the new vocabulary. It was the new ideology. There was an ideology on every poster. Now, as we went through the 20th century, you had sort of a number of transformations of the nature of the discourse for political opposition. So that the first half of the 20th century, you had then what I would call the old-fashioned nationalists. The upper middle class, the middle class, bourgeois, European-educated people, males. European-educated males who determined what was their local nationalism. After World War II, it became clear, at least to the younger generation, that old-fashioned middle-class nationalism was simply replacing one set of exploiters of most people by another set. And the old male nationalists simply sat in the same chair that the French Governor General had sat in Damascus, or the advisors in Egypt, and so on. And so that in the 50s and 60s, then you had a whole new generation. Now, it was still male, but you had to be earnest-looking, set for the future, and a handsome young Arab, or a handsome young military officer. Idealistic young colonels became the mode of the day, and how they sold themselves, in a sense, was with a grand ideology. Now, by the 70s, it became clear, at least for my leftist friends at that time, that radical idealistic socialism had become, in their terms, oppressive state capitalism. And the young officers became middle-aged officers, and became old officers, and became the dominant new mode of upper-class imperial control over society. And so you have then part of the coming in of Islam as a major factor. And the next ideological face, I mean, if we were to do a series of faces of the ideology of the time, you have Nasser, and not every Islamist. I mean, my friend Hassan Tarabi in the Sudan does not have a long white beard, and it was always carefully trimmed. But the face of the new ideology of political Islam is very often identified with people like the Ayatollah Khomeini or Islamically oriented people. Now, the difference is that these were religious rather than self-consciously secular. But they were both ideological. The new face. The new face is Facebook. The new face is YouTube. The new face is Wael Ghanem. And you can say a lot of things about Wael Ghanem. Sophisticated technologically, all of this sort of thing, a Google marketing executive before he became one of the symbols of the Tahrir Revolution. But he's not an intellectual ideologist. Now, I'm really looking forward to next week in my class. I have a course that I teach called Contemporary Islamic Activist Intellectuals. And this Contemporary Islamic Activist Intellectuals course, then we start with how do you define intellectuals? You look at Benda, the treason of the intellectuals, written in the 1920s, who sets the theory. Or you have Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, who then talks about organic intellectuals. There's a whole literature of who are the intellectuals and what are the intellectuals. In the last 2 or 3 sessions of that course, of my course, I picked people that I think are interesting ways of raising the question of, do we still have important intellectuals in the politics of democracy and in the politics of social movements? And so next week, my graduate students will have read a book called Revolution 2.0, The Power of the People is Greater Than the People in Power, which is the memoir that has just been published by Wael Ghanem. And it's going to be really interesting because the people in that class have gotten into some really interesting arguments over whether or not you could consider people like Wael Ghanem an intellectual. This last week, we talked about Abu Masoud Assouri. Assouri was the ideologue for scattered, decentralized Al-Qaeda strategic organization. And the class, we got into this big discussion. Do you have to think that, is somebody who advocates killing lots of people within a strategic framework, is that somebody who is conceptualizing things in a way that makes it possible to call someone an intellectual? And the people in the class ended up really sort of saying, the way we look at intellectuals is, if we think what they're saying is pretty good, then they're intellectuals. Otherwise, what they are fanatics. But we've got a new kind of mode and approach, which is no longer ideological in the old sense of ideology. That as you look at the faces of the contemporary Islamic world and the people who are involved in democratic movements, let me go to the next one for a minute and see. Now, can anybody Is there anybody here, I won't make you recite, I promise, but is there anybody here who recognizes the guy in the yellow t-shirt? Is Hakeed, who is a Moroccan hip-hop / rapper. And as one looks at all of the coverages, the coverage, for example, just in February in the Washington Post, of how the Moroccan democracy movement has been going forward with the elections and so on. You have this guy, who was one of the pioneers of the coming of Arab Spring to Morocco. But he did it not by issuing a proclamation. He didn't even do it by Facebook, if you will. YouTube was probably his major vehicle. But what you had is somebody who, as a rapper, was able to create slogans, not ideologies, but the slogans for mobilizing people out on the streets. And this guy Hakeed then, in Paul Shem's article on the Moroccan democracy movement, says that the 25-year-old rapper with the February 20th movement, whose songs excoriating the palace and social inequalities in the country became the soundtrack for the movement. Now think of that. That's just a nice throwaway analytical kind of thing. Think about what that means for the moment. Come over here. I've been looking at that here for a while. Think about what that means. And I promised the young woman that I wouldn't fall off the stage, although I did say, you know, if the audience appears to be becoming distracted, there's a way of really focusing attention, and that's to fall off the stage. It's amazing. You know, I've seen people do it, not necessarily consciously, but it really concentrates attention. But think about it for a moment, that we're looking at somebody who was a key element in pushing the constitutional reforms that King Mohammed instituted in Morocco. This guy, you know, turn around hat. You can go on YouTube and you can hear his songs. They are not necessarily the kind of songs that I would replace my Mozart with while I'm doing work. But you have then something that can be called the soundtrack of the revolution. Not the Thomas Paine common sense of the revolution, not the Jefferson Declaration of Independence, but rather you have the soundtrack of the revolution. And that word soundtrack is used for a number of the people who were very important in setting the slogans. This is the soundtracker, if you will, for the Tahrir movement. This is Rami Assad. And his soundtrack is again on YouTube. I used it in a couple of classes. It's really kind of fun. I was giving a talk to a retirement community in Florida, which was also, then it kind of woke them up. But it was a simple song, and they all sort of really felt then that they had heard sort of an Arabic slogan, because his song is Irhab. Now he says, the people only want Agawahda, good Egyptian colloquial, they only want one thing, Irhab. And so most of the song is everybody saying Irhab, dozens and dozens of times. Now Irhab means get out. You know, the regime should go away. Mubarak should get out. And that is the soundtrack, that kind of thing is much of the soundtrack of the revolution, which emphasizes in a sense that this is not necessarily an ideologically based sort of thing. You look at what people say they want. You look at what Wael Venom says. And he's talking here, he uses Revolution 2.0 very consciously. I mean, he argues that in the old days, you had a standard way of doing revolution. Let's call that Revolution 1.0. And now we have the new mode of revolution that only a Google executive could really think of, or whatever, but we have the new mode of revolution Revolution 2.0. So we have then a non-ideological kind of thing, which is a very good mobilizing thing. Now, I was wondering, that there was reported in the New York Times a slogan as people marched into Tahrir, and it was sort of gather the tea, gather the belly dancers, and my heart will stop bullets. And I sort of thought, that's not a very, I can't really march to, gather the belly dancers, my heart will stop bullets. But I had a student who said, no, that was a really nifty marching slogan. If you put it into Arabic, and I won't inflict my Arabic on you, but if you put it into Arabic, it is a very good rhythmic slogan for marching in. It's not an ideological statement. It's a statement of mobilization and participation. And somebody like Alwaleed argues, he says that I am not advocating activism. He says, I am advocating engageism. The new mode of political, the new mode of the politics of democracy is engageism. Now in that, we have then some different faces. Some of you will recognize, these are the big faces, if you will. This is Erdogan. The transition, Turkey was one of the pioneering transitions, and I'm looking forward to the panel that deals with Turkey. Turkey was one of the pioneering transitions from the old-fashioned Islamic involvement in the public sphere to the new thing. And Erdogan and Abdullah and the people in AKP, in that new party, were important in defining that. Also, right at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, you have these two figures who don't look wildly revolutionary, but they represent also this kind of new, non-ideological Islamic voice. These two people, get myself down here again. These two people are Amin Rais and Abdurrahman Wahid Gasdur. After the overthrow of the military regime in Indonesia at the end of the 20th century, which is in many ways a prototype for Arab Spring. A military dictator was overthrown, and then you had democratic elections. And the pattern, if you say it in the abstract, sounds familiar to what we've just seen. That is, you had the overthrow of a military dictator. You had then the demand for democratic elections. And you had a new president democratically elected, and that new president was the head of the largest and best organized Islamic organization in Indonesia. Gasdur Abdurrahman Wahid had been the head of Nahdlatul Ulama, which has a follower number of more than 30 million. Now, if you think about that for a moment, let me drop that 30 million into a different context. The total population of Iraq is about 30 million. So that he had as many members in his organization. He had as many members in his organization as there are people in Iraq, even before the recent problems. And what is his position? He says, everybody should be guided by their religious faith. And the government shouldn't get in the way of people being guided by their religious faith. And therefore, the tradition of constitutional religious pluralism, rather than religious statism, is the important guideline for the future of Indonesia. Now, for reasons other than his politics, I mean, he was a good intellectual, and it's one of those lessons, intellectuals don't very often make good politics. He left the office of presidency and was recognized as being really a pretty incompetent president. Sweet president, though, and I argue that an incompetent, sweet president was what Indonesia needed at the beginning of the 21st century. It enabled them to solve the problem of East Timor and so on in a relatively satisfactory way. You have then a more momentary kind of new ideology. But the new elements as well are the elements of female activism, and I'm looking forward to our next panel. Tahrir was not the old-fashioned ideological democratic participation. It was a newfangled democratic participation in which women played a very important role. Ranging from the tough women in the factory who began the labor union strikes. And some of you may have seen the stories in, I think it's in Minya. There was a big factory. There were women who were, there was a woman who was very upset with not equal rights and not employment and things like that, and then the suffering of the working class under the Mubarak regime. And she said, let's call a strike. And she got all the women to join her, all the women in the factory joined her. And so what happened then was all the women stood outside the factory and shouted insults as only, what should we say, working class Egyptian women can do, shouted insulting slogans at the cowardice and the incompetent men who were still inside, and forced the men to come out and join in the switch from this being simply Tahriri to a labor-supported movement was a very important part of the transformation, and women played a very important role. And then, of course, our Nobel Prize winner, Tobacco Carmen, who is an Islamist in Yemen, who got the Nobel Peace Prize and all of this. This is not an ideologue, this is a look at what she advocates. You know, equal rights, justice, and so on. This is not putting forward a new Islamist ideology. She is not advocating an Islamic state in the old sense, in the old-fashioned ways of doing things. And so you have a Tawakal, and as a current voice, I like to, I don't know that either of them would like to be paired with the other. But Tawakal Carmen, and this is Zaina Anwar, who was the organizer of a now global organization called Sisters in Islam, that goes directly to Islamic messages, and has, they don't have grand treatises, they have little pamphlets. Is it Islamically legitimate for your husband to beat you? And the answer that Sisters in Islam gives is no. It is a misunderstanding of Ayah 434 to say that the husband can beat the wife. And they argue in the trenches. One may or may not agree with the linguistic analysis of 434. Is it 434? You should obey. If your wife doesn't obey, then persuade her. If she isn't persuaded, beat her. You have a strong argument. Now, these two people are both Islamically oriented, and neither of them are putting forward a new radical ideology for establishing an Islamic state. What they are doing is they are putting forward an advocacy for a pragmatic program of reform and of social change and social transformation. And works of people like Sister Zaina are really transforming issues of feminism in the public sphere in the Islamic world. And I want to just sort of close my picture thing. This is a Moroccan artist. Mohad has also been Hakim in looking at sort of the new voices. Basically, in conclusion, what I would like to say about, as we're looking at this subject, Islam and the politics of democracy in the 21st century. What I want to say is that we are in this transformation time. I talked about in 3 different transformations: the transformation of religion, the transformation of democracy and democratic participation, and the transformation of the public sphere itself. But transformations don't just simply mean an end. You know, there was a Punch cartoon many years ago that unfortunately I never clipped out, but it shows somebody with a big gong, and you know, the end of the Neolithic era, gong, and then there are no more Neolithic farmers anymore. In the same way, this transformation, what we are seeing, and I think is most visible in a place like Egypt, is that there are continuities. I'm not selling my book Continuity and Change in the Modern World, but there are continuities as well as change. And the continuities rest on some of the new ways that we look at democracy and the old ways. When we say we want a democratic system, we say we need fair elections. But if you say we need fair elections, the people who win elections are the people who are organized. The people who win elections are the people who have grassroots organizations. You can have all of the brilliant Facebook pages, you can have Islam Way, you can have all sorts of things, but if you don't have a word healer on the ground, you don't win old-fashioned elections. And so that the Tahrir movement created a context in which we had the new modes of political mobilization, but the new modes of political mobilization don't necessarily win votes. The old modes do. And so that as we look at the politics of participation and the politics of democracy in the contemporary world, what we are seeing is a real interaction between the old structures and institutional politics and the new structures, or the new non-structures of participation. The old structures of organized activism versus the new structures of essentially the flash mob engageism. And so as we look then at our new world, we've got, you know, what I've done is I got your attention. I want to close in just a minute, and Anna and I, we're talking about, I want to give at least a little bit of a chance before the break for there to be 2 or 3 sort of questions, which then I will take those questions and use them as a summary. But I just want to finish with 2 quotes. Some of you may be familiar with the very useful magazine called Wired. It's very much into the contemporary media. And Wired, back in 1996, wrote about politics in the public sphere. The public sphere of the past, with pamphleteering, soapboxes, and vigorous debate, is being replaced by the internet, which enables average citizens to participate in national discourse, publish a newspaper, distribute an electronic pamphlet to the world, and generally communicate to and with a broader audience than ever before possible. Now, that was in 1996. And now, oh yes, that sounds nice. But today, it sounds, in light of the Arab Spring, it sounds archaic. I mean, it is non-participatory, it's almost as non-participatory as the hard copy pamphlet thing. And the same author who did that book just last year, once I finally started catching up with so that I can do email, Wired has this marvelous article that said essentially email is dead. Nobody uses email anymore. If you're with it, you've got all of these other apps and whatever the things are. And so that, but he wrote an article called "The Web is Dead, Long Live the Internet." The Internet is the real revolution, as important as electricity. What we do with it is still evolving. As it moved from your desktop to your pocket, the nature of the net has changed. And I think that what we've done is we've gone from the coffeehouse pamphlet to the desktop web to, I did sort of turn this off so it wouldn't ring, to your pocket participation in the revolution. And there, I think, the pocket participants in revolution and the old-fashioned board leaders are representing two different modes. The real competition in the world at this point is not a clash of civilizations. It's a clash of modes of participation to accomplish what you want in the public sphere and in the political arena. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Voll has agreed to take 2 or 3 questions for a summary comment. Would you like to come up to the front and use the microphone?
What do you think?
Can you hear me okay? All right, if you can hear me, we can hear you if you talk loud. I can repeat the question. So, yeah, would you mind coming to the front, please?
Yes, hi. I just have a comment and a question on the account that was presented on the Arab Revolution. And I'm speaking as somebody who actually lived every almost minute of last year in the Middle East and lived the details of this revolution.
Microphone, come up here, come up to the mic.
I'm sorry, sir.
Okay.
And also state your name too, if you wouldn't mind, please.
My name is Saif, and I'm from Wisconsin. Well, I don't know where to start, but I almost disagree with every single point of your account, basically. And because the narrative and the story of the Arab Revolution is part of the dynamics of revolution and counter-revolution now. And essentially, the narrative that is presented in the West, especially by somebody like Thomas Friedman, who wants to convince us that the Arabs were inspired by the West, presenting the Jean Sharp account that the Arab youth read. Jean Sharp spoke about democracy and democratic transformation, and they were inspired by it, or the Facebook account, which I have the question. The main question is how we can assimilate the account you presented with the fact that the revolution began in Sidi Bouzid, one of the most peripheral areas in one of the most peripheral countries in the Arab world, where the internet services are almost non-existent. Second, one of the most important, an active parts of the Arab Revolution was actually in Suez, in Egypt, and not in Tahrir Square. But Tahrir Square was presented in the media, and Suez, which had more people killed by the authority, and the revolution was not really non-violent as the West romantically, or parts of the West romantically presents the revolution. It was, in certain parts, was really very bloody. Most importantly, the account or the aspect of the account that there is no ideology. Actually, the ideology is at the center of the dynamic of the counter-revolution, revolution dynamics, and in particular the fact that the neoliberal counter-revolutionary forces are promoting freedom, which essentially means the free flow of labor, goods, and capital, as the freedom that people are actually seeking, which is not really the truth. And that's the account that the NGOs are promoted, the NGOs being essentially agents of imperialism. Let's just put it bluntly like this, as some people in the Middle East understand that. So the freedom that the people in the Middle East seek and want is not really the neoliberal freedom, which essentially means the freedom of capital. And in that sense, the narrative is very important because it's at the center. The account of the revolution is at the center of the revolution, counter-revolution conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please. Yeah, if you don't mind, please. I'm sorry. Oh, there's a microphone for you. I'm sorry. Yes, please. If you wouldn't mind please stating your name.
Thank you very much. My name is Saeed Jamshidi, and I really enjoyed the talk. I learned a lot. Thank you very much. Am I too loud? Okay. So here's the question. I was a child, like a baby, when the Iran Revolution was happening, and I still remember people are writing slogans on the walls, or they were just giving out the pamphlets. And then I was adult and in the United States when I heard many accounts. I was a reporter many years and then come back here and talk with my editors and reporters back there when the Green Movement happened. And then they are explaining that, okay, it was a Facebook, the surge of many of the Twitter updates and messages that were just going around to tell people where to go and what was the next move. But here's I think, the dynamic that I think I would like to understand, which is these messages have always to be produced. I mean, even if you, give the pamphlet to the other people or produce Twitter or whatever, it has to be produced by some special people. I mean, some of the people gain the leadership of producing those. And how realistic it is to rely on this kind of internet, I would say stimulation or internet messages that is going around, because as we see, sometimes it's not really reliable way of communicating with people. And the last point is, I think if we just, I think I stop here because the other point is going to take more time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. There was one more hand. Sir.
Hi, my name is Mohammed Lami. I'm from Sudan University.
Take it away from your mouth.
Okay, just like this. Okay, I have a question about the future of these political, socio-economic transformations that are taking place right now in the Middle East, particularly in countries like Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia. The question deals with the future of these transformations. And the second question actually deals with who is going to shape the face of these transformations. Are we talking about all the members of the Egyptian society, for example, or of the Libyan society, or we are talking more about the newly rising intellectual class? Some members, for example, like Wahid, the one that you were referring to, other youths, for example, from countries like Morocco, they are the ones who are going to shape the future of these transformations, and if they don't do so, what is going to happen as a consequence of that? We might end up with a new type of intellectual autocracy down the road, because it will be an exclusion of the decision-making process, because the have-nots are not participating due to the fact, due to political efficiency or high levels of literacy. And what about also the impact of the economic hardship on these transformations? How far can they go, and when they're going to stop? And is there a possibility that they might stop because of the economic conditions in some of these countries? Thank you.
Okay, we've got just a couple of minutes and we can get ourselves into the freedom of the coffee break. I think I'm going to be a disappointment to the first questioner because I don't see a great deal of disagreement between, I see a great deal of difference in terms of vocabulary, but not a great deal of difference in terms of what we are really looking at. I think it is very important to make sure that we know that the street and the participants, are the clue. Ultimately, the virtual reality, the virtual realities of social media did not fill Tahrir Square's human beings did. Part of the difficulty, though, I agree, Sidi Bouzid is a lovely, lovely oppressed place. But there are lots of Sidi Bouzids. There are hundreds and thousands of them around the world, not just in the Muslim world. And there are lots of people who have tried individual protests who have committed suicide in some kind of a public way. In Egypt, there was an attempt in the April 6th movement, and we were all Khalid Saeed and so on, that in looking at movements, there has to be a starting recognition that there are oppressed and discontented people who want to bring some mode of opposition to the system of suppression and repression. That is a constant in history. The question for movements is not, well, is not necessarily why is it, you know, why are the poor discontented? The question becomes, how is it that the discontent of the poor is so often ignored? How is it that people don't mobilize when thousands and thousands of people are suffering from disease, hunger, from AIDS, from a whole variety of things, and most of society, most of the time, is surviving? And so that the question becomes then, what is it that makes Sidi Hussein, what is it that makes Khalid Saeed in Egypt and so on, what is it that makes them different from the normal suffering protests of people of the thousands of people who protest and get ignored? And I think that what we have then are questions of how do you mobilize, how do you mobilize recognition of the oppression? And historically, those mobilizations have varied depending upon the ability of people to get their message out. In the old days in Cairo, 200 years ago, in the 18th century, what you did was you went to your Sufi sheikh, and he would mobilize the local Sufi groups, and they would go and demonstrate in front of the Pasha's palace, kind of thing. I think that without the social media, there would be oppression, and there would be movements. There would be movements to try and reduce and eliminate that oppression. But those movements would not have the same rapid ability of mobilization that the social media has done. I think that the interesting thing in that is that talking about the new kind of revolution, and where I do think we disagree, I think talking about the ability of people around the world to engage effectively in virtual communication as well as actual coffee house communication, I think that that is something that is not necessarily an imperialist imposition of the West on the rest of the world. As we can see in the Occupy movement here in the United States, it is also a movement for people who are discontented here. So that I think that we look at then the old idea of ideology. I do think that yes, people have a mobilizing narrative and discourse, and who defines that discourse becomes a very important kind of element. I think that the two groupings that have been mobilized but have not yet created their institutional manifestations or ability are youth and women. And in looking at, trying to think in general about the question of the future, I think that any movement that persists in having people over 45 be the dominant, males over 45 being the dominant institutional force in the new society, that any movement that insists on that ultimately on the long run will fail. Now what that means is, though, that that's a moving scale. That is, that everybody who is now 20 at some point will be 45 unless they die. And this was the problem with Mubarak. This was the problem with Nasser. This was the problem with the Assads. When they came in, they represented the young generation, but they didn't know when to get out. And I think that the youth the gender issues and generational issues become very important. And I think that, again, in terms of, they're always, the messages are always there. And the question then becomes, how does one get the message out? And and the walls worked for a while. But again, the Green Revolution never got past the public participation to the organization. And whether you're talking about 70, and this is true of 78, 79, that you have all of those reports, the Western reports that thought of this as, well, it's going to be a middle-class democratic revolution. But those guys weren't organized. The people who had organization were the people who had the older indigenous networks that could put forward. And the more secular-oriented people that the West tends to look to and say, oh, these are the good guys, tend not to be nearly as well organized. And they are exterior dependent. And it becomes then important to recognize the local. Before, I was reminded that many years ago, I started using the term, and I think that rather than seeing the world as divided between the imperialist West and the rest, in the old style ideological thing, I think that we are rather looking at the important and prominent interaction of global forces that are not necessarily Western and local particular identities. And so that in many ways, the current revolution, a really horrible word, of globalism, that we are viewing the emergence of localized revolutionary forces where you have significant indigenous elements as well as more global elements. And I think that the global elements are not just Tom Friedman's kind of support for imposing his strange views on what the rest of the world should be. But we are in a new era where we've got lots of really interesting questions, and I think some of them will at least be discussed. I won't promise you that they're all going to be answered, but they will at least be discussed in the next 2 days. Thank you.